Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's JOFA webinar entitled Work-Life Balance, Equal Pay, and Staying on the Promotion Track, Advocating for Yourself in the Workplace. A mouthful. My name is Sarah Steinberg, and I'll be moderating tonight's session. You can find more information about the JOFA webinar series at jofa.org/webinars. Before I introduce tonight's presenters, a little housekeeping. Behind the scenes tonight are two JOFA staffers, Rachel Lieberman and Aaron Steinberg. You can chat with them using the questions tab in the control panel, and that's also where you can post any questions that you have throughout the webinar. The format for tonight's webinar is that we'll start with brief introductions, and then we'll jump right into the presentations by our two speakers. After about 30 minutes of presentation time, we'll begin with the Q&A session. So please be thinking of questions and submitting them in the chat box for us to see. We'll queue up your questions and answer them as best as we can. I'd also like to note that you're more than welcome to send a note to us in the chat session about your background. It's not necessary at all, but if you'd like to, we'd like to know more about our audience. And if you don't want to do that, no problem at all. But we would love to hear from you, and we definitely would like to hear from you regarding your questions for this session. So I'm looking forward to the next hour and our focus on the practical advice for the key moments in work-life cycles. We're very lucky to have two extremely accomplished women leading our discussion. So let's get started. First, I'd like to introduce Dee Goldenhar. And you will notice, I'm sure, that we have a last-minute program change tonight. Shifra Bronznik, founder of AWP, Advancing Women Professionals and the Jewish Community, very unfortunately had a last-minute and unforeseen change in her schedule, and she's not able to be with us this evening. But we're fortunate, very fortunate, to have Dee here stepping in. Dee has been AWP's senior program consultant since 2001, and she's participated in every aspect of the organization's action, research initiatives, signature programs, and advocacy campaigns. She's the co-author of Leveling the Playing Field, which is AWP's 2008 guidebook for advancing women and creating gender equity in Jewish life. And she and Shifra have also collaborated on many projects in the Jewish social justice sector, co-authoring Visioning Justice in the American Jewish Community. She has a passion for systems change and social justice, which extends to the public school leadership area, early childhood education, youth development, and health care. And she's been a thought partner in writing advisor for many organizations such as the United Way and Echoing Green, the Open Society Institute in Baltimore, and many, many others. Her most recent publication is Networking a City, which is published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it's about the power of relationships for making profound social change. So welcome, Dee.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ariella Migdal. Ariella is a senior staff attorney at the ACLU Women's Rights Project. Since joining the Women's Rights Project in 2007, Ariella has worked in the areas of equal opportunity in employment, gender-based violence in schools, single-sex education, religious freedom, and as well as the collateral consequences of tough on-crime policies for low-income women in housing and employment. She currently focuses on litigation and advocacy to combat discrimination against women in traditionally male-dominated occupations, such as women in the military, sex discrimination in pay, promotions and hiring, and pregnancy discrimination. She has a very impressive background in law. She clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court of the United States and for Judge Harry T. Edwards on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. She received her JD from New York University of Law, and she also holds an MA from London University and a BA from Harvard University. So welcome, Mariella. Finally, just a brief word about myself. I'm the former Executive Vice Provost of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm currently the founder and principal consultant of Frogstone Strategies. I advise colleges and universities and related organizations on revenue growth strategies. Prior to founding Frogstone Strategies, I was the inaugural CEO of Shalom Learning, which is a nonprofit organization focused on teaching Jewish education in blended online and on-site formats. And I have engineering degrees from Cornell University, an MBA from Northwestern, and a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. So let's get started with the presentations. Dee Dee, I wonder if you would like to begin this session with a discussion of the research that you've done, the experience, and the advice that you have for advancing women in the workplace.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's really an honor to be here. I hope you all know that Shifra would have wanted to be here. I hope you'll be comforted by the knowledge that Shifra and I have worked together and been friends since 1979. So I'm bringing my own experience and I'm channeling Shifra. I want to put your issues, your questions, against a backdrop of our work at advancing women professionals in the Jewish community. So I'm going to use the first 5 minutes to give you some context about the history of this organization, which was founded in 2001 and which has had a long and very nutrient relationship with JOFA. There's a lot of synergy, as you might imagine, between the two. A lot of your individual questions and issues sometimes seem individual, but they're actually signs of systemic issues within your organization, which might have to do with the policies and sometimes the explicit and sometimes unseen practices and behaviors of your organization. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, which is what can you do individually and where do you have to dig a little deeper to look at some of the policies, practices, systemic assumptions so that you're really not alone. There are ways in which looking at your organization can bring you into contact with peers, allies, people above you and people laterally and people in other organizations. So I'm trying to create community here among everyone on this webinar. First, a little history about AWP, which was founded by Shifra Bronsnick in 2001, and why? Because she saw that, what was it about the Jewish community? A community that valued meritocracy and justice, and a community in which was staffed 80% by women and yet was dominantly led by men. As CEOs of organizations, presidents of boards, and in the public square, the narrative seemed to be almost exclusively male, whether it was panels at public conferences, plenaries at the GA, op-eds in the newspaper. Where was the women's expertise? Where was women's scholarship? Where was all the experience that the Jewish community could benefit by? Why were the women being stuck? So AWP was founded as a systemic intervention to change the Jewish community for the good of the Jewish community. That's why we call ourselves Advancing Women Professionals and the Jewish community. The first phase, in looking at the arc of change over the last 15 years, our goal was to move the community from awareness of a problem to caring about the problem, to taking action on the problem, and then to take effective action on the problem. And the way we began was by doing a lot of research. I'm bringing this up because doing your own research, assessing your own organization and community, is really a big part of making change for yourself and others. So for the first few years, we did a lot of research and education in the community in which we showed where the gender bias was, both on the ground, on the facts, in the positions, and in interviewing the leaders and the professional staff, women and men, about their assumptions and belief. And it was very clear there was a lot of gender bias. There were gender bias in the positions, certainly in the salaries. Yes, this reflected the wider society, but we felt this was the world that we really needed to change. Having presented the research, creating a common fact base, we then moved into the next phase, which was doing all kinds of pilot projects and experiments. Experiments about work-life policy, for example, with the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services. Experiments about selection processes for women rabbis in the conservative movement. Experiments about work-life balance in Hillel, the national campus-wide system. And in all of these, we were raising awareness, stimulating caring, and helping people learn how to take action in their own context. About halfway through our history, I would say in about 2007, we realized that we could no longer depend just on the CEOs, on the people in power, on the senior executives to be making change. We really had to call on everybody. And we really began to believe that everyone, women and men, have the opportunity and the duty to make change no matter where you sit in your organization. And that's what led to the writing of our handbook, Leveling the Playing Field, which Shifra and I wrote with our colleague, Marty Linsky, then of Harvard's Kennedy School, in which we used the concepts of adaptive leadership and adapted it to our communal context, in which we helped people through a very sequenced set of guides. You can find it on Amazon, Leveling the Playing Field, how to assess your organization, select a strategy for change, build the allies, alliances that you need to make change, and then monitor the effects. And we started really working on individuals, both to cultivate the nascent, latent talents of women leaders in the community, rabbis, organizational leaders, thought leaders, scholars, advocates, and activists, from mentoring to negotiation training, and calling upon men. This led to our signature project with men called Men as Allies, in which we asked men to take a pledge not to speak on panels in which there are no women. And we now have more than 75 men signed up. We started our action learning teams, in which we gathered 8 to 12 women in several cohorts for 18 months to teach them how to advocate for themselves in their own careers, and also to stimulate and pursue systemic change in their own organizations and communities. And I'm going to go back to that later, because I think of tonight's seminar as an action learning team experience, in which I'd like to help you think about your own career trajectory and also how you can push change in your own context. And we launched the Better Work, Better Life campaign, in which our goal was to get 100 Jewish organizations around the country to improve their work-life policies by instituting formal flexibility and/or paid parental leave. I have to tell you, we didn't want to do this campaign. It seemed very counterintuitive to us to advance women into leadership, to push for more women leaders, and at the same time say we want them to have flexible work schedules and ample paid parental leave. And yet we knew that's where women were getting stuck. Mm-hmm. We also knew we needed to shift the community's understanding of high performance from hours and activities to outcomes and impact. And once you shift that performance dial, you realize that the entire organization will benefit when we make that shift. And that we're also affirming our deepest Jewish values around family, community, spirituality, cultural life, and education. Are we going to walk the talk? Are we going to live our values through our policies and practices? We are now at 93 organizations, which includes JOFA, which offers our gold standard of paid parental leave of, I'm just going to pull my note here, for employees who have worked for at least 12 months or longer are eligible for 12 weeks of leave following the birth or adoption of a child. The first 8 weeks are paid. So I encourage you to go to our website, advancingwomen.org, where you can find the list of enlisted organizations and see sample policies. This is very helpful for you if you are in an organization and you're not sure of your policy. If you're at an organization and you want to move the dial on these policies, you can find sample policies. You can find a way to contact a peer consult to help you through one of the wonderful HR directors we've been working with since 2009 on this campaign. So, much work has been done, much progress has been made, and we still feel there's a lot of progress to still be made. There's still a gender pay gap. We've gotten 100 organizations. That's a catalyst towards more change. We need hundreds more to join this campaign. We want to see more women in thought leadership, more women in the public square, more women CEOs. And I have to say that now, in 2015, we're in our last year of formal operations at Advancing Women Professionals. We've made a strategic and we think innovative choice to close our doors at the end of 2015, not because we're hurting as an organization, not because the work isn't done, but because we believe that having started as a catalytic intervention, it's now time to push the work out towards our very robust network of catalysts. That's you too. And in fact, we have found that some of the most profound work being done now is by women in the Orthodox community. One of our action learning teams is the Orthodox Leadership Project. We have developed a leadership curriculum in partnership with Yeshivat Maharat. So we see how these issues are ever more urgent, and we're so thrilled to be working with you. Again, my contact information is available to you. As we go further into this conversation, I'm going to be talking more about some real tips and preparation ideas for negotiation. I'll be curious to see sort of where you're coming in, what you're curious about, what your priorities and pain points are. And again, to really be thinking about yourself as straddling the intersection between your personal career trajectory and wearing the gender lens. You are not alone. Whatever problem or challenge you're facing, someone else has faced it, and it's probably linked to a systemic issue in your organization. So I really want to help you see what we have learned to call the dual agenda based on work with our mentors at MIT and at the Center for Gender and Organizations at Simmons College. The dual agenda is about equity and effectiveness. So that's what we want to promote tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dee Dee. That was really, that was excellent. I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A, so I just remind the audience of a couple things. First of all, some of the links that Dee Dee talked about are being posted in the chat session area, as well as Dee Dee's biography, I believe, is there, her bio. But please start thinking about your questions. And now we're going to turn to Ariella for your remarks. And why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dee Dee. And I guess if you can't hear me, you'll chat to me. It's such an honor to be here and to be part of this webinar and to learn from Dee Dee and Sarah and everybody at JOFA. My context that I bring to this is that I am an attorney in the women's rights world more broadly. So my knowledge base is federal law, domestic policy. And so what I want to do is try to put some of the challenges that Dee Dee is talking about and the pain points that Dee Dee mentioned into the context of federal policy and what the laws are that kind of frame the moments at which women encounter inequality in the workplace. And so I'm going to mention three main areas of law. One is discrimination law, basic hiring and firing and pay. And the other two have to do with women's roles as caretakers and the discrimination that women encounter when they get pregnant on the job, when they want to return to the workplace after having a baby, or have other caregiving responsibilities. So I'm actually going to start with hiring because that is the first moment at which women often encounter inequality that they don't even know about. And so the law that governs equality in hiring is our Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's been amended a few times, but Title VII of that act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in hiring. And that includes discrimination based on sex stereotyping and what we call gender steering. And so that's when you're looking for a new job and you're told, for example, I'm not sure you'd really be interested in this position because it requires a lot of travel, and I know that you have young children. Or when you just aren't offered a position that may require a lot of travel. I litigate cases mostly on behalf of low-income workers, but not only. I had one case on behalf of municipal workers in the New York City public schools, and the positions there they were competing for were the positions of the school custodians. And they were told, you don't want this job. This requires you to come in early in the middle of the night in the winter and run the snow plow. And that was only when they were sort of confronted with smoking gun evidence of discrimination. More frequently, they just weren't offered the job at all. And it wasn't presented to them as an option. And so Title VII prohibits that kind of discrimination. It's often very hard to know that you've been subject to discrimination in hiring. Title VII does cover not only employees, but applicants for a job. And so if a workplace sends you the message that women need not apply, for example, for a managerial position, that's going to be discrimination under Title VII, but it's very hard to show that sometimes, and that's where statistical analyses will sometimes come in. A case that many of you may have heard about was the Walmart case from a couple of years ago that went all the way to the Supreme Court on behalf of millions of women at Walmart. And what they were saying was that at Walmart, women were steered into the lowest paying jobs, so you would see women staffing the front cashier offices, whereas men were working as managers. And I think in our world where we have, for example, you see the same thing in education. You'll see schools where many of the teachers are women, and certainly the teachers' aides, and then lo and behold, when you get to the principal position, that position is staffed by a man, and that's something that Dee Dee has talked about, how that works. It's Title VII that prohibits that kind of discrimination, and that law covers workplaces with 15 or more employees, and many states have laws that ban that kind of discrimination as well. So that's kind of at the front end. The other thing that happens at the front end is that salaries are set, and this is the beginning of the gender-based pay gap. It's commonly said that the women still earn 78 cents on the male dollar, and that breaks down across sectors. It's true within sectors that women are paid less than men for the same work, even when you factor out the hours worked and other controls. And the law that prohibits pay discrimination, equal pay for equal work, is a very old law. It's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and it needs some updating. You may have heard about the case of Lilly Ledbetter, and her case sort of shows how the discrimination that begins when you start the job can follow you all the way through your career and sort of compound upon itself. So Lilly Ledbetter took a job with Goodyear Tire, and when she took the job, she was being paid less than the guys who were doing the same work that she was doing. But she didn't know that. Most companies don't have pay transparency. It's not required in most contexts. You may not know what you're making, but you may not know what the guy next to you is making. And some companies even ban employees from talking about how much they make, so you'll never discover that you're making less than the guy who was hired the same year as you with the same number of years of experience. Well, after working at Goodyear Tire for a long time, somebody slipped Lilly Ledbetter a note telling her, hey, you make a lot less than the guys you're working with, and every year that we get pay increases, this gap is compounded. Now, the reason the person slipped her a note may be because so many companies do ban talking about wages, and retaliating against workers who reveal their wages and discuss them has not been prohibited. So that might be the motivation for slipping her a note. In any event, when she went to court over this, the Supreme Court ruled that it was too late for her to contest the inequity. In other words, because she had not complained about this when it first started, and of course she didn't know about it then, it was too late for her to complain about it now, or she couldn't recover for all of the years of discrimination. Congress stepped in that case and passed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and so now that's no longer the case. Now you can, once you find out about the discrimination, the pay discrimination, you can go ahead and recover for all the years of discrimination. But there's still a lot of updating to the law that needs to happen. There's a bill right now in Congress called the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would update the equal pay laws and, for example, would address some of the issues about retaliating against people for sharing their wages. And so that's a campaign that my organization, the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and many other women's groups have been involved in trying to get that law passed, and it's come close a few times. I now want to talk about the sort of key moments when women are pushed out of work or marginalized or sidelined. And the first set of those happen when women become mothers. And I'm going to do this show my screen thing here. Let me see if it works. So I'm hoping you can now see my client on the screen. So this is Julie DeSantis Mayer. Hope you can see her. And she was a worker for UPS. And when she had worked there for 10 years, and after she became pregnant with her first child, her doctor advised her not to do heavy lifting on the job. And this is something that happens a lot when somebody becomes pregnant. She may need, many people can work without any accommodation whatsoever, but some people, when they're pregnant, need a minor workplace adjustment. And that's what happened to Julie DeSantis Mayer. And when she asked UPS to be able to work light duty, which was an accommodation that was available to other workers who had injuries, temporary injuries, they denied that to her and pushed her out onto unpaid leave. And she lost almost a year of work, essentially, while she was pregnant. And this is an issue that is currently before the Supreme Court in a case called Peggy Young versus UPS, a related case to Julie's case. And the question is whether, when workplaces provide minor accommodations like the ability to sit down at work instead of standing, or the ability to drink water on the job, when they provide that to other workers who have temporary injuries or temporary needs for an accommodation, do they need to provide it to pregnant workers? The problem is that many workplaces will not accommodate pregnant workers, and they push them out, and some courts have said that this is okay. And the Supreme Court will ultimately decide this soon, but in the meantime, many states and localities have gone ahead and enacted laws specifically requiring reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers, including New York City. So New York City now has a Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And I'm going to show, we have a little map, which I think will be sent out in the materials, that shows which states have laws protecting pregnant workers. They were passed last year in Minnesota, in Illinois, in California. And this can be really big, including for women who work in, just trying to get back to the webinar. There we go. For women who work in jobs requiring a lot of physical activity, teachers are often affected because sometimes teachers need some schedule flexibility in order to go to appointments, doctor's appointments. Also, people working in healthcare are affected quite a bit, and I'm going to scroll now to another client of mine, if I can figure it out. Here we go. Jamie Cole. Jamie worked in a nursing home and in the caregiving professions that are predominantly staffed by women, like nursing homes and like childcare. Oftentimes, pregnant workers in those professions need a minor accommodation. And that's what happened to Jamie, and she was feeding 2 other kids at home. She's the primary breadwinner in her family, and she needed to be able to work light duty. And again, the nursing home where she worked, although they had some desk jobs, they did not want to make those available to pregnant workers. And so that is the kind of, and she was in North Carolina, which does not have a Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and so that she did not have recourse, and she's currently trying to get recourse. A similar problem happens when women come back from having had a baby. Many women are denied the accommodations or ability to pump breast milk on the job. We represented a woman in Colorado named Heather Bergbacher. She was a teacher, and if any of you are teachers, you know that the schedules are really, can be rigid, and she wasn't given the break time that she needed in order to pump, and so she had to bring legal action over that. There are some protections for women in that situation, which I'm going to go to right here. There it is. The Obamacare law has actually enacted an amendment to the labor law that requires hourly workers to be given reasonable break time to express breast milk, and also requires employers to provide a place other than a bathroom that is shielded from view and free from intrusion from coworkers. And if you've ever pumped, you know how important that part is, where you can pump breast milk. So they can't stick you in the bathroom, they can't stick you in a closet, and they can't tell you that you need to pump in your car if you are a covered employee. Now the problem is it covers primarily it covers hourly workers, and so many women find themselves sort of caught in between. Many employers are undertaking best practices and trying to make the protections that are required under Obamacare also available to non-hourly workers. But it's sort of a work in progress, I would say. And then some women are simply mommy tracked when they come back from giving birth. Or another version of this is women are the primary providers of elder care for their older relatives who need care, and sometimes they have to take their parents to appointments, and they can be sidelined or marginalized when they take that leave. There are some protections, and the most well-known is the FMLA, which entitles covered employees to 12 weeks of job-protected unpaid leave for the purposes of tending to either your own serious health condition or to for childcare and when you've had a new baby, and sometimes to care for others. And so, but it has a number of restrictions on it, including the fact that you have to have worked for the employer for at least a year, for a certain number of hours, and it has to be a certain size of employer. And one problem, sort of cutting edge issue that we're seeing with the FMLA is that when women become pregnant and they may need a minor accommodation or they may get put on bed rest, the employer will essentially force them to start their FMLA leave early, and then they run out of it before they give birth. And so they're not even able to make it to the point where they come back from childbirth, or they're told you have 2 weeks after the baby is born, you have 2 weeks left of your FMLA. And this can really send women into an economic spiral and financial insecurity. So that's something that we're working on a lot. These issues affect people differently depending on which sectors you work in, and so we will be interested to hear in the questions how these are coming up for you. But I wanted to give you that overall context of the federal laws and to emphasize again that many states have better laws. Of course, some states are enacting paid leave, and some companies are, of course, adopting it. But at the federal level, it's unpaid leave at the moment. And I think I'll turn it back now to Sarah to facilitate questions.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ariella. Just a ton of great information. Reminding the audience again to put your questions, I think, into the question area, but if you put them in the chat area, we'll figure that out too. Ariella, one quick question came in while you were speaking. Someone asked whether you had a suggestion of resources for people who are living in Canada. So outside the United States, do you have any particular recommendations there?
I don't have the law on Canada, but if that person sends an email, I can at least point you to organizations. So the American Civil Liberties Union, we have affiliates in every U.S. state, but we don't do any international or law in other countries. And so I would point you to the affiliate of the ACLU in your state, but we do not have an ACLU in Canada, although of course there are civil rights organizations there. So if maybe that person can send their email.
Great. Another question that I have is that both of you touched on this issue a little bit, and that would be finding out more information about what's going on in your workplace. And I would imagine, I certainly, if I were in this situation, would be concerned about retaliation, even if I'm protected by the laws. So what practical advice do you have for women who are wondering about these questions of whether somebody might be paid more than they are or things like that, where perhaps they're entitled to ask the question, but they're still very concerned about retaliation or some other action being taken against them? Ariella, do you want to start with that answer? That question, rather? Can't hear you.
Yes, now I'm unmuted. Sorry, I keep muting because we have a windy night here. Yes, retaliation is a huge problem, and this is something we've been advocating on. The ACLU advocated quite a bit with the White House, actually, and President Obama, to at least ban retaliation for inquiring about wages for the workers for which the White House has some legal dominion, and those are the millions of federal contractors. I was very surprised when I learned how many organizations and businesses are actually federal contractors. And so when President Obama took this, he signed a executive order banning retaliation against employees of federal contractors for disclosing or inquiring about your wages and saying, you know, hey, Doug, how much do you make? You've been here the same 10 years I have. It's actually a very large number of businesses. It's many millions of workers. I've seen 26 million workers thrown around as one of the numbers. So it's a large number of workers. So one thing to try to figure out, if you think, you know, you're wondering what the first of all, you can ask if your organization has wage transparency, or you could try to figure that out. And if they are a federal contracting organization, then they are now banned from retaliation. And this is one of the things that would come up in the Paycheck Fairness Act. And some states, I should add, have paycheck fairness type laws. And so this is an issue that's currently moving, but retaliation is a problem. Retaliation is illegal under Title VII for complaining about sex discrimination. So the retaliation that is still exposed is the part where you're asking about your wages. But if you complain within your organization about sex discrimination and you're retaliated against, that should be covered by the civil rights laws about discrimination and some states' civil rights laws as well.
Great, thanks. And Dee Dee, do you have some comments about that?
Yes, I do. I was completely captivated by your presentation, Ariella. I just want to say a couple of things first. First, around the issue of paid leave, I want to direct everyone to an absolutely fabulous op-ed that has just come out in E-Jewish Philanthropy by Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay from the organization Avodah, which really makes the Jewish case for paid family leave in a very beautiful, strong way. And if you're in New York State, you know that Governor Cuomo is being approached by many influential leaders to make sure that he pushes through paid family leave in New York State. So I just want to do that while this advocacy movement is gaining momentum, and that it's being supported by a really strong editorial today in E-Jewish Philanthropy. About salary, about talking about money, one of the things that I find so challenging, upsetting, and yet another way encouraging about Ariella's wisdom and information is that if you're working for a Jewish nonprofit, there is a kind of cultural injunction against, I mean, we haven't seen any lawsuits brought against Jewish nonprofits for gender discrimination. And that's because that would be hanging out our dirty laundry, and that's culturally very much a taboo. So that puts that much more emphasis and urgency to the subject of negotiation. So in terms of talking about salary, we always say, let's break the taboo about money. Talk to your colleagues about what you make. If not in your own organization, find people with comparable positions in other organizations. Do the research. Ask what people are making. Go to GuideStar. If you're in the senior management, GuideStar publishes, I think, like the top 5 salaries of every nonprofit organization. It doesn't yet go below that, but there are often resources on Google, on the web, that can tell you generally what people are making at different levels, though it will vary depending on the size of your organization and where you live. But this brings me to negotiation, about which I couldn't encourage everyone. Negotiate, negotiate, negotiate more, negotiate at home, negotiate with colleagues, negotiate with your children, negotiate with purveyors, negotiate with service people. Women avoid negotiation, and for good reason. Women really bear the brunt in negotiation of a lot of bias. There is a gender lens in negotiation. Women who negotiate like men are seen very unfavorably. So I urge everyone to go to our website, where we have adapted a lot of material from the experts on the gender lens in negotiation, Linda Babcock and Sarah Leshever. And we've also have a link to some of the sort of top tips in terms of preparing for negotiation, which means doing the research, practice, think about what the win-win situation might be for you and the organization. It's really about we, not I and you. Think about, like, practicing. Again, practice with your colleagues, with a friend, with your husband, with your teenager. Practice for that negotiation. Put a lot of issues on the table, not just your salary, but resources. Do you need an assistant? Do you want to go to conferences? What kind of professional development do you want? What kind of stretch assignment would help you grow in your leadership? One part of the title of this webinar is the promotion track, And I would rather say the leadership trajectory, because you may stay in this organization, but think about it across organizations also. So if you go on our website, if you look at these links, you'll see there are things to do to prepare. There's ways of operating within the negotiation. Most importantly, separate your role from yourself. This is business, even if you're in a nonprofit. You're not being insulted. You may be treated in an insulting way. It's your job to remain optimistic, to look for solutions that benefit both you and the organization, to keep making that case, to bring the evidence, to set a high bar, higher than you're thinking right now, much higher, to understand what is your absolute bottom line, at what point you're willing to walk away, to understand you can slow a negotiation down. You can say, I think we've talked enough for now, I'd like to come back to this. To be someone who engages in dialogue and problem solving rather than seeing it as a solely adversarial situation, which may be induced by the person you're negotiating with. Therefore, women have to remain pleasant, optimistic, problem solvers, dialogue keepers, and then troubleshooting, when to come back, what you're willing to settle for. Again, the more issues you put on the table, the more you have room to move things around. So negotiation is so important, whether it's your first job, which may peg you to a certain level, when you go to a new job, negotiate.
That was fabulous. Some great practical tips on negotiation, which I think everyone needs to know. A question has come in asking in a similar way about some practical tips for moving up in an organization. Women often hit that glass ceiling, and it's very hard to break through. In a similar way that you tackled the negotiation issue, do you have some tips to offer on breaking through that glass ceiling?
Well, I'm going to go at this a couple of ways. One is to look at yourself personally. What are you doing to move yourself forward? What stretch opportunities are you asking for? What committees are you asking to, or work groups are you asking to be part of? And then outside the actual job, how are you building your public profile? When are you going to write an op-ed for E-Jewish Philanthropy about an issue you care about, or any other organization? We have partnered for quite a long time with something called the Op-Ed Project. Founder Katie Orenstein is teaching women how to put their opinions and their voices into the public square. Men on the leadership trajectory understand that it's not just doing the job perfectly well and dotting all the I's and crossing the T's that leads to leadership positions. It's about who you're becoming in your context, in your community. So volunteer for a panel. Don't turn it down if you're asked. Look for opportunities to put your voice out there, to get on a board, to show that you are a leader. Maybe your position feels limiting right now, but what are other ways to move your skills and expertise and to own your expertise going forward? There are the systemic issues, but I'm focusing on the personal ones right now. And as far as the systemic ones, that's where negotiation comes in, not to wait to be asked, but to go to your immediate supervisor and say, I would like to keep growing here, and present a plan.
Let's stay on that personal track for a second. Part of the webinar is about work-life balance. And Ariella, I wonder if you could step back a little bit from the law and talk a little bit from a personal point of view about work-life balance issues. You certainly touched on them actually in quite a great amount of depth on things like the pregnancy in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit, perhaps from a personal point of view or from other people that you know, how you balance the work-life issues?
Sure. And before I do, I just wanted to, I'm so interested in what Dee Dee was saying, and I just wanted to add one thing that I've recently seen a lot about, which is that I've seen research about the fact that women in organizations are often volunteer, but they volunteer for the housework of the organization. There were these studies that women are taking notes, or they're cleaning up, or they're on the planning the parties. I guess I'll answer Sarah's question, but I'm just wondering, how you factor that in. I just thought that was fascinating, and it's come up for those of you who are following the POW trial in Silicon Valley, brought on behalf of a woman who did not make partner in a venture capital firm, which was this very male culture, very hostile to women that she's alleging. So that's my question for Dee Dee. But let me answer this one first. It's a struggle, but I will say that as a woman who's been privileged to enjoy an education and degrees and not to work in a physically demanding job, I've been privileged to confront the work-life balance issues from a sort of white-collar perspective that's very different from the nursing aides, for example, who I represent in nursing homes. But I would say the issues that have affected me and many of my peers are described in a great campaign right now by another organization called Make It Work, and they have this campaign going on right now called How Do You Do It? I think it's a hashtag, How Do You Do It? Or tell us how you do it. And people sort of send in these clips, and it's everything from relying on partners, relying on grandparents, having flexibility at work. At one point when I had 2 small children, I was doing some telecommuting for a law firm. So that's one opportunity. I've been privileged to have that sort of flexible work schedule. At another point when I was clerking at the Supreme Court, actually I was pumping, and we did not have Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, so I pumped in the bathroom. So I think nowadays they would need to have to provide the hourly workers at least with a private space other than a bathroom. But that's how I did it at that time, and I'm fortunate now to work at a flexible nonprofit. So it really depends. Women professionals, I've heard every kind of story in the world. Many of my Jewish women friends are in healthcare, or they're doctors, or so they talk about pumping when they were residents in some kind of supply closet. I've heard everything, and I have special admiration reserved for my friends and colleagues who are doing it as single parents or as single caregivers for elderly or people with disabilities, because part of it, of course, for all of us is sharing the burden within a family. And so those are my perspectives, but I think it's very different when you're working a desk job. You're not having to do heavy lifting. I have an office door that I can close now, so when I had my 3rd child, I just pumped in my own office. That's very different, for example, from the custodial staff in our building who may not have an office that they can duck into to pump. So the issues will affect you differently depending on which sector you're in. I think for many highly educated women and perhaps professionals, Jewish professionals is in the name of advancing Jewish professionals, travel comes up as an issue that has to be negotiated and dealt with. And perhaps some of you have been in this position of having to either pump or be pregnant when you're on the road. Pumping in opposing counsel's office is a memory that I take with me. But those women are very creative about negotiating those. I think one thing I'd also like to hear about from Dee Dee that I see is women, when they find a flexible environment that allows them to manage their child care or their elder care responsibilities, they then stick in that and don't perhaps feel free to go for that next transfer that will take them to Cleveland. So that's another thing I'm so curious to hear about.
So why don't we go to UDD, and we actually only have about 5 more minutes, so I want to get one or two more questions
Okay.
in, but she
I
did
just want
send
to
a
say
couple
an
ones.
answer to Ariella's question about being the housekeepers. There's a way of if some of you have read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, it's all about what women can do, and women should change their behavior, and women shouldn't step away from the table and lean in. And of course, we say, like, yes, lean in, but if the system is rigged against you, then it makes leaning in rather tough. She and a guy named Adam Grant have written a series of columns in the New York Times over the last month or so, in which they're really looking at the systemic issues, and one of them was exactly the one Ariella just raised. So don't volunteer to get the coffee, or if you're asked to take notes, say, I will do it this time. The next time, it would be great if Adam took the notes. By the same token, women often find their views muffled, muted, or ignored at meetings. I'm sure both of the women on this call have had that experience. You're in a meeting with a bunch of men, and then you say something, and then John says, and everyone says, oh, great, great point, John. So get in the habit when one of your women colleagues makes a point and then some other person raises it, say, you know what, I actually agreed with that, and I thought it was good when Sarah first brought it up. In other words, there's a way of supporting each other and putting yourself forward. I want to say about the flexibility issue, this is why AWP has been advocating through the Better Work, Better Life campaign for formal flexibility. Many women feel like they're getting something from their immediate supervisor who happens to be benevolent and giving them, like, you can have Fridays off. Although we're going to take away 3% of your salary, or you can have Friday off, but don't tell anybody. But you're really always sort of working in dribs and drabs. This is why we think it should be policy. It really works better for the organization if there's a formal, flexible policy to which not everyone, not the receptionist, not people who have to be at the desk will be there, but for people who can do and will do better work at home for some kinds of work, including writing and thinking about things without interruption, it can work for the entire organization, promote more coherent, cohesive teamwork, and actually contribute to organizational excellence, again, by putting the emphasis on outcomes and impact rather than hours and activities. But Ariella is absolutely right. One of the things we found with our action learning teams was, as a woman was promoted or was granted a flexible part-time schedule, she then felt she couldn't push for anything else, that she had used up her capital. So there's timing involved with all organizations. And I also want to say there are different inflection points, as Ariella said, at the birth of a child, at the birth of a second or third child. There are times when you can make a move, the move between elementary school and middle school, or middle school and high school, or when the child goes off to college, where there are natural inflection points. See them as opportunities for yourself as well.
Just great. I hate to bring this session to a close because the conversation is just fabulous. We've covered issues of negotiating in the workplace with just fantastic tips, practical tips for people to follow. We've talked a little bit about the lean-in strategy and how you can leverage your strengths in the workplace. We've talked about the accountability, not so much, we haven't touched so much on this, and I think another session would be great on the accountability that the employer has for all of the topics that we've been talking about that we haven't really had a chance to touch on. In 30 seconds, because we're really up against the end, I'd like to ask each of you if you would just give 2 tips to the audience, keeping in mind that we've got people in the audience from large organizations, from small 1- and 2-person organizations, just running the full gamut. What tips do you have for the people that are on this webinar about leveraging the strengths that they have in the workplace? And again, if you can just try to keep it to 30 seconds, that would be great. Ariella, you want to give a shot at that? And then
Sure. Sure. I think mantra at the ACLU is know your rights. I've given some materials to Sarah I think they're being sent out as links that help you know your rights in the workplace. The map I showed before is interactive, so if you are in Minnesota or you're in New York City, you can go on and figure out whether you are protected, for example, by a pregnancy accommodation law. Half of states have breastfeeding at work laws. You can figure out whether you work for a federal contractor, and if you do, you're protected when you ask about what everybody else is making who is doing your same job. So arming yourself with that information, in my view, is the first step, and oftentimes employers are responsive to that. When women come in and say, not only do I have a note from my doctor, but I have this little one-pager that says what I'm entitled to and that I get 12 weeks of FMLA leave, for example, that can help avert problems that may have come up. So that to me is an important first step when you're moving through the workplace. Just understand what your rights are and what your employer's responsibilities are.
Great. Thank you so much, Ariella. Dee Dee, last word goes to you.
I would say, since you're all part of JOFA, at the end of this call, at the end of this webinar, sometime over the next few days, contact somebody else who you think was on this webinar and have the conversation about what your strengths are, what you want to own in terms of your expertise, and what's the next negotiation you want to practice. Find a peer. You're not alone.
That is so great. Thank you both. Thank you everyone on the webinar for joining us tonight. Recording of the webinar will be available in a couple days, and you can find the recording for the webinar along with the recordings for other webinars done by JOFA at jofa.org/webinars. And one last note from JOFA that Passover is coming, in case you hadn't gotten word. And you might be interested in JOFA's Pesach Seder Activity Handbook, which is filled with discussion guides, games, and more for children and adults of all ages. And you can find those resources as well as many other resources, including all of the information from tonight's webinar at jofa.org. So please make sure to fill out the 2-minute survey that you will see at the end of the webinar. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. And thank you again, Dee Dee and Ariella. It was a fabulous webinar, and I enjoyed being with you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank
you for leading.
Take care.